right, good evening. Welcome everyone, and thank everyone for coming out on this cold and wet night. We certainly appreciate you coming to speak to us and update us on the building project initiatives and other matters. Thank you all to all the committee members for this kind of off-cycle meeting. I certainly appreciate your time. So just want to make a few opening remarks here. I think, just to set the table, I think we had our initial presentation, well over a year ago on the school building project. So we were interested in receiving an update, and so I want to thank you for coming tonight to provide us with that. There were some questions from this committee about, the FinCom role, and FinCom is expected to weigh in on all significant matters that come before the town. You can reference Section 2.9D, 3 and 4 of the town charter. It's part of our role to get involved and understand significant matters being presented before the town at town meeting. So we did get questions in advance, and Jen had asked for questions. I was more than happy, to accommodate and solicit the group to get some questions. There was some feedback from this committee on furnishing those questions, in advance. But certainly, under the open meeting law, it is certainly allowed. Schedules, documents, and other preparatory matters are allowed to be distributed in advance to facilitate the conduct of the meeting and allow you time to research. And I passed out the section of the open meeting law that allows that to take place. So certainly nothing that was done here is in violation of the open meeting law. You certainly can't deliberate and debate, but certainly you can get the questions out in advance, so we're happy to do that. Right. And FinCom, and the town administrator and his finance team isn't here. They're welcome to join us. They weren't specifically invited, but we felt that there'll be ample opportunity to involve the town administrator and the finance team. But this was more for our committee to get an update directly from the school committee and the school committee leadership. So that was another question that we had from my team. So the way this will work tonight, you're going to give us a presentation, and we'll run through that. We've submitted, I believe, about 30 questions. My preference would be for us to go through the questions that we've given you in advance. You've had a chance to review them, out of fairness to those that have submitted them as well. And then certainly we'll make time for any other questions or feedback that this committee has and that we want to make time for. But that's about all I had to say to kick it off. Mr. Leith.
Just a general question. When I sat down here, I did not realize that the screen was behind me, and I think I might be in the way of that, so I don't know who's running the camera, but would you like me to move?
No,
I'm all set?
You're fine.
Okay, thank you.
You are welcome to move if you don't want to turn your neck around.
It's following this,
okay.
I suspect.
All right, very good.
Okay.
Yep, thanks.
Any other questions or comments before we get into the presentation? All right, take it away.
Okay. Hi, I want to introduce myself, Jennifer Gaossetz, head of the school committee. I have Dr. Lincoln Lynch here, the superintendent, Dr. Bridget Goff, principal at Johnson Bird Middle School. I always confuse them, and Michael Bryan on school committee. And we have members of school committee back here, Mike Frisha as well. I'm going to start by saying if I could sum up what I've learned about Walpole from my time on the school committee, I would identify 3 themes: fiscal responsibility, planning ahead, and transparency. We will be taking all of these themes into consideration during the process of identifying a solution to the problems presented by the aging school buildings in town. I want to start out by assuring the public and this board that the school committee has not chosen an option at this time to best meet the needs of the town. What we have done is submit statements of interest to the MSBA, which you will learn more about during this presentation, utilizing the expertise of an architect hired through a state grant, Carl Franceschi, who presented to this board about a year ago. First, in terms of transparency, we will be exploring various options with the experts at the MSBA once we are accepted into the process, whether it be this year or next, or one of the years after that. And we will be involving the community in the decision-making process. We want to hear your thoughts and questions because we can only arrive at a solution to the problems by hearing everyone's questions, seeking input, and utilizing everyone's expertise. There are a lot of really smart and talented people in this town, and we want to tap into those resources. Second, in terms of fiscal responsibility, our solutions to the problems presented will likely be different than if we had unlimited resources. Third, in terms of planning ahead, I think we should look at all of the secondary school buildings and determine if there's a way to address the needs of the greatest portion of the student population in a cost-efficient manner. We may want to look at renovating existing buildings, but I suspect we'll see after going through the process that it may be impossible due to modern construction codes. Also, we may not have the ideal parcel or parcels of land to accomplish everything we want to do, and there will likely be additional costs if we try to obtain land. We will need to give all of these factors serious consideration, and in the end, by working together and compromising, I know we can find the best solution for Walpole by balancing all of these factors. In terms of seeing what the issues are with the public schools, I want to introduce the public and this board, for those of you who haven't yet taken tours of the buildings, I know a lot of you have, that we're going to be doing public tours of the middle schools on November 18th, starting at Byrd Middle School at 9 o'clock and Johnson Middle School at 11 o'clock, because I think that's really the best way to see some of the issues that we're grappling with. We will also be presenting to the Board of Selectmen on December 5th, and we did present this information during our school committee meeting on Thursday, November 9th.
So, by way of presentation overview, this evening you should expect to hear about secondary school concerns, middle school limitations, high school limitations, what is 21st century learning, what is the Massachusetts School Building Authority MSBA grant program, how does MSBA use taxpayer money, how would Walpole start working with MSBA, what is an SOI, which is a statement of interest, MSBA building process and eligibility period, working with MSBA project team. We'll then talk about the task of a potential feasibility study, questions they will explore during said feasibility study, and what happens following a feasibility study. We'll talk about other nearby districts and how they've done long-term planning, and I'll also update an anticipated timeline. So, without further ado, we will pass the microphone to Dr. Bridget Goff, who will talk about, she'll begin with secondary school concerns. Dr. Goff.
Good evening. A lot of this, as you'll see, is outlined in greater detail in the statement of interest, but looking at our secondary schools, so that would be the next things. You know, looking at a couple of major issues, you know, the overcrowding and the lack of learning and collaborative spaces. In terms of overcrowding, over the years, the space has been required for alternate non-traditional spaces to really ensure student learning and collaboration. So for example, at Byrd Middle School, we took the old library and we divided it into 2 classrooms to make a health room and a special education program room to keep students in district. Then what we did is we took the tech room and divided that in half to keep the technology room and then to make a library, and we actually took all of the old furniture from the old library and housed it there. At Byrd, we closed a lab to create a reading classroom, and Johnson closed an art classroom to convert to a science classroom because this was the best space for science tables. It wasn't science conducive, but it was the best space to put the tables. And that at Byrd, I also created and converted a classroom into a science classroom as well because we needed that room. In terms of the music, there's a lack of music rooms at both middle schools. Both middle schools hold chorus right now in the auditorium. And as an added bonus for me, I hold it in the cafetorium. Some of you were able to see that on the building tour, which means that there are times that I need to hold chorus during lunch. And also we're unable to hold, sometimes we have to move chorus if I need to have assemblies in the auditorium. Our English language learners and our MECO class spaces, they're actually shared. It's a 209 square foot space. There's a half wall divider that separates this area from our computer lab, which is on the first floor. It's in the middle of the hallway. And that has no doors, and it's surrounded by lockers. And what we did is I had to move the teacher workstation to be located on the other side of that partition to make room for our occupational and physical therapy to service those students. In terms of also lack of learning spaces and collaborative areas, the science classrooms, they really lack at the middle schools adequate prep space, and teachers are limited in their instruction, and they therefore have to modify some of the existing curriculum, particularly experiments, to meet the facility constraints. At times, they'll hold labs in the hallways in order to be able to meet their needs. And that's a concern with our next generation science standards that are occurring at this time. Some of the additional middle school limitations, as I mentioned, the cafeteria and the auditorium seating, especially at Byrd, that's poorly aligned, and that is in need of an upgrade, which will trigger code requirements and infrastructure upgrades. The existing structure of the ceilings are too low, and that would make installation of new building systems costly. In terms of technology, electrical systems are very taxed. They're not capable of supporting our current needs of power to our classroom computers, projectors, smart boards, outlets, network drops, and we have an antiquated clock bell system. JMS, as you know, with their location, the wetlands that are adjacent to Johnson, that will prohibit opportunity for us to build or expand. And then we've had failed heating systems at Byrd. Last year we had a cracked pipe in the cafeteria. Fortunately, our custodian was there on a Saturday and was able to catch it, so we didn't have a complete flood on Monday morning. Tonight, I actually have 3 trucks sitting outside Byrd Middle School because there is no heat in the media center or the gym. That went out this weekend, and so they're working on that. And then they're also working on the parking lot side of the cafeteria because there's something burnt out there, but they're working on it, so hopefully they'll get that taken care of by tomorrow. And then also, I know I mentioned in terms of the gym, inadequate seating, we mentioned. There's really no space for spectators, and sometimes we have to overschedule our physical education classes. So even though teachers will split into teams, the space will still limit the number of students who are able to participate, and there's no room for them to sit during a game, and we cannot have any school-wide events in the gymnasium. So in terms of our school limitations in high school, that it's reported that, you know, Walpole High School is in good physical condition, but it's significantly overcrowded, lacking inner spaces that can support this 21st century education. And you can see there from the slide the building size of what it is compared to the MSBA suggested guidelines. And they too, for their population, have undersized spaces, including classrooms, science labs, their gymnasium, their auditorium, and their CAF. And really that flexibility is limited, again, to collaboration and project-based learning and problem solving. So in terms of, you probably keep hearing 21st century learning. You know, what is 21st century learning? And as you can see on the slide, it's really one of the main differences that we have is the need to prepare our students now for critical thinking and analytical skills in this time. And really, 21st century, it's a set of skills that they need to succeed in learning. It's broken down to your literacy and your innovation skills. That's your critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, analytical thinking, and then your digital literacy skills. That's your media, your technology, and then also your life and career skills. Those are your self-direction, your leadership, your adaptability. And this is really critical for economic success. It's not the stand and deliver anymore that maybe what we were used to. Students really need to be engaged in project and problem-based learning that is led and facilitated by teachers. So we're in need of facilities that have these spaces for collaboration, for communication, for adaptive furnishings that ensure the flexibility that we need. Students are active learners in the process, and right now, and speaking for the middle schools, the buildings are really poorly designed for collaboration and communication. And not only have we used every single space imaginable, we're really in need for rooms to be used for different purposes: small group instruction, video projection spaces, interactive science labs, space for performing arts, you know, to have chorus in a chorus room, to have room to have lessons during the, you know, the school day that students are able to perform. Typically, these learning areas allow for a range of different activities. So in a classroom, you could have a reading group, you could have learning spaces, project space, reflection, and presentation models. So there's really a mixture of that. There's actually a quote by Andrea Schleyer. She's the Director of Education and Skills for the Organization of Economic Development. And she says, the world economy no longer pays you for what you know. Google knows everything. The world economy pays you for what you can do and what you will do with what you know. So it's that application portion that's so important.
So you may be asking, what is Massachusetts School Building Authority and what is their grant program? MSBA is an agency within the Treasurer's Office, created in 2004. It took over for the previous program that was administered by the Mass Department of Education. It partners with local communities to construct affordable, sustainable, and energy-efficient schools. It approves a specific number of projects each year based on needs and available dollars. Last year, they had $600 million annually to spend, and that includes the first payments for all the buildings. They pay upfront their percentage of the project. They make evaluations with a team of engineers and architects. They also employ financial experts. They have 80 people working for them at Massachusetts School Building Authority, whereas in the past, the Department of Ed had 4 people. So there's much tighter reins on the money. So you may want to know what MSBA, how they use taxpayer money. MSBA has a dedicated annual revenue stream of 1 cent of every dollar collected on the sales tax, and currently the sales tax is 6.25% that we all send to the state. It has an 11-year history. In its past 11-year history, it has doled out $12.4 billion in reimbursements to school districts. It's rare that a district will undertake a large school building project without the support of MSBA. So throughout the process, we will be using the procedures promulgated by MSBA if accepted into the grant program. We will have to have all our budgets approved. We'll have to have all our square footages approved, enrollments approved. They have a very tight grasp of how money is spent, when it is spent, and who are on certain committees to approve spending. They have a prescribed building committee that we have to use that is different than the Walpole Permanent Building Committee. How would Walpole start working with MSBA? Well, at first we have to submit an SOI for each building during the annual open submittal period. Our first submission was a year ago, April. Our second submittal was April. We are currently in a holding pattern similar to when we last spoke. We expect to hear by December 12th, so within a month, of whether or not we're invited into the grant program. So the invitation to the MSBA eligibility program is only the first step in the process. And what that means is when we're invited into the process, we then have to engage their regulations along with our communication to our community. And our next target is May town meeting, which I'll get into the timeline shortly. So the SOI informs MSBA about the deficiencies, as Dr. Goff had delineated, that exist in local school facilities and how these deficiencies inhibit the delivery of current and future, very important, educational programs. Submitting SOI into the MSBA's capital pipeline is only the first step, as I had said. Moving forward, the process requires further collaboration and partnership. Applications are extensive and need to include limited answers to many educational questions. They actually limit the number of words that you can use in your application. So I would remind the community that all of our SOIs are open for public consumption on our webpage, Walpole Public Schools webpage. Very easy to Google that. We have the report from McGuire Report from 2013 that was a genesis of looking at all of our schools. We have the Carl Franceschi DRA report, which guided us towards a suggested first solution that was provided in our SOIs, and all the SOIs are out on the webpage, including Byrd, Johnson, and the high school. So those are all there, as well as the projected timeline, so it's a very transparent process. And the plan, through our communications subcommittee of the school committee, which we had a meeting last week, it's posted, it's available for people to attend. And we are talking about creating our own webpage as a spin-off for just school building progress, updates, information. So it's a very transparent process, and we would invite everyone to participate. So, the next slide is for Jen, and Jen will go through the building process.
So, I like visuals, so I thought that this was, it was helpful to see just how we partner with the MSBA. Some of the questions that we got, we really can't answer at this time, and part of the reason is because we have experts to answer those questions. So you can see the blue shows the things that we'll have to do on our own, and then some of them are broken in half where you're going to be partnering. So for instance, during the eligibility period, we furnish them certain documents like how we maintain our buildings, for instance. Things that our district possesses that they don't, we have to give it to them in order to form the partnership and to come up with ideas. And as you give them information, you move into some of the later stages where, they kind of take the ball and run with it. So I thought that was just kind of helpful to visually show that. During the feasibility study, next slide, the task of the feasibility study, the district and its team, we're going to document the educational program. We're going to look at, do an initial space summary. You document existing conditions, establish design parameters, develop, evaluate alternatives, and this is important. You come up with the most educationally appropriate and cost-effective preferred solution for MSBA consideration. So the goal here is that you work together, you partner together, you get community input, and at the end of the day, you're going to come up with one solution that's most educationally appropriate and cost-effective to go forward with. Many districts spend a lot of time in this phase while they narrow down options, and there will be public hearings to discuss these options. The next slide. Some questions that we thought we might want to explore during the feasibility study, and once we get community input, I'm sure we'll have many more questions, but some that we had off the top of our head. What's the cost of new construction of a high school, a combined middle school, or 2 middle schools? What would be the cost of renovations to both middle schools and or to existing buildings? Is there an educationally sound way to solve the needs of the 3 secondary facilities with 1 new construction project? Does the current high school building meet the needs of future high school students? How about future middle school students? What are the limitations of the 2 middle schools and the high school? Does Walpole own land for a new high school for all athletic activities? We realize that's important to people. Would Walpole consider buying land for a new school building? So we'll want to look at all of these questions. Mike?
So the conclusion or the output from a feasibility study would be one preferred solution. And again, that when we say that term preferred solution, it's what would be most appropriate academically, educationally for our students, as well as cost effective. So the output from the feasibility study, one of these options that have been vetted with the public, all these various options that we've identified and perhaps others, boiled down to one. And with that one option, what would come from that would be schematic design, so engineering plans, tools that could then be used to develop costs, the actual construction costs for the project. So that one preferred solution, engineering plans, and we've got costs associated with it. And so what happens with that then is in the hands of the MSBA, and now by knowing what the costs are, they can then determine what the reimbursement rate would be for Walpole. And what's important to know is that the total project cost may not all be considered allowable costs from the MSBA. Like for example, if the town decided we want to go forward, we want to build a new school, but we want to buy a piece of land and build it on a different location altogether. The cost of the land is an example of something that's not an allowable cost. So that would be at the expense of Walpole. There are other examples where there are certain allowances, dollar per square foot allowances for different portions of a school building. If you exceed those excess costs would not be considered allowable costs. So what would come from that, the engineering plans, the construction costs, go to MSBA, they come back with a reimbursement rate. So we would know at that point in time exactly how much would be paid for by MSBA, and also how much, and most importantly, how much would then be the taxpayers of the town of Walpole. So with that information, what would then, the next steps that would have to occur would be to present all of that to town meeting with ultimately the request to support the funding for the part that Walpole's accountable for. So in other words, an override. So that would have to go before town meeting, and then an override would have to be requested, and then the town of Walpole taxpayers would have to approve that override in order to proceed. If those steps weren't approved, then obviously we don't proceed at that point in time. Couple next slide here. Actually, the next two slides, what this gives you a sense for, and I guess the slide up there is a little tough to read, but what it provides is a list of list of local towns: Braintree, Dedham, Franklin, Medfield, Natick, Needham, Norwood, Sharon, Stoughton, Westwood, and Wellesley, and different projects, school building projects that they have either completed or have underway. And what this data shows is it gives you a sense as to specifically what the total project cost is, and also what the rate of reimbursement is from MSBA. And if you go to the next slide, what that shows you there is a little bit more granular information for Natick, Dedham, Needham, and Medfield. And what it shows is, in each case actually, where they've got multiple projects that have been completed over a period of time. And I guess as I look at these last two slides, I guess what strikes me is, and I think really the crux of our message here today is, I look at Natick where they built the middle school in 2003, the high school in 2012, and now I guess they're looking at another middle school in 2018. And clearly they could not have gotten to that point in time without engaging all the stakeholders in their town, without bringing out those, you mentioned earlier, Jen, I think, to the extent we've got a lot of smart people in the town of Walpole in various disciplines to come to the table, different perspectives. They couldn't have gotten to that point without challenging any assumptions. So to the extent that we've made any assumptions, they all need to be challenged, and we absolutely appreciate that. And so I think I'm encouraged to see that towns that we would associate, I think in many ways, town of Walpole to, whether it's you know, in terms of the types of town that they have, the school systems, the athletic programs, et cetera. A lot of these towns are towns we're very familiar with. And I'm encouraged to see that they've made it down the road to achieve what I think is some strategic outcomes for their town, and I think that's what we're hoping to achieve. And it could only have happened with a lot of collaboration and a lot of listening, and I think that's where we are right now.
So the anticipated timeline you have before you, clearly the November 13th is this evening, an update for you folks, the Finance Committee. November 18th, as Jen had mentioned, we're having public tours of the middle schools. At 9 a.m. Bird Middle School, and at 11 a.m. Johnson Middle School. December 5th, we'll be making a very similar presentation to the Board of Selectmen. To be determined, community presentation, I guess that will depend on whether or not we hear good news before December 12th from MSBA about a decision whether or not to invite Walpole schools into the grant program. So the dates below December 12th, 2017 are contingent upon being accepted into the grant program. And if we are not this year, the deck is reshuffled. So if 17 of 89 projects are approved and we are number 20 on the list, we would not start as number 3 next year. It would all be reshuffled for next year, and we could be number 20, or we could be 30, or we could be 50, or 5. It all depends on how many projects are submitted and how they compare to Walpole. So if we are invited, the following will occur. By May 2018, we would have an annual town meeting and we would request money for a feasibility study, an appropriation of between $1 million and $1.5 million. For example, Middleborough just passed a new high school, and their original feasibility was estimated at $1.4 million. MSBA negotiated that down with the town to $1.2 million, and the bids came in at $950,000. So we have to estimate on the high side, and that estimate was provided by DRA Architectural, the firm that did our secondary school building study that was paid for by the state within the last 2 years. And then by June, we will start working on the feasibility study if that is passed and if town meeting appropriates the money. And it will take about a year to study all the options that we had listed earlier in the presentation. Now that is 4 options. There may be an option that this finance committee would like to pursue. There may be an option the Board of Selectmen wants to pursue in addition to those 4. And that would have to be considered, and that would have to be funded at town meeting. Whether that adds a certain amount of dollars to the feasibility study, we don't know. We would have to do an estimate about that. But we are obviously open to studying all options so that we can include as many people in this process as possible. Following a year of study, we would then need a final approval from MSBA on a preferred solution. So of those 4 or any other options, we would work with MSBA to create a preferred solution to move forward. That would be the one project. When that is approved, we will have hard numbers for MSBA, and they will start calculating the percentage rate of reimbursement. So the most recent project we had, we were reimbursed at 48.68% for the Fisher School. So that's where we would start, plus incentives. If we had an energy efficient building, they would add points, etc. And then they would decrease the amount of costs that aren't allowable, like land, like a synthetic turf field versus a regular field. They don't pay for synthetic turfs. They pay for regular fields, etc. They pay only 8% of the overall project for excavation. So if it was over 8%, that percent over 8% would not be allowable. You get the theme. So that 48.68% would drop. So then in the fall, the Board of Selectmen would have to vote. It would take a 2/3 vote for a debt exclusion to be placed on the town election ballot. And then it would be the Walpole citizens would vote on the debt exclusion. The difference between an override and a debt exclusion, an override is a subsection of a debt exclusion is an override as a subsection of an override. An override is continuous. It is always a permanent addition to the tax base. A debt exclusion, the life of a debt exclusion is only the number of years you borrow for. So if you borrow for 10 years, it's for 10 years and then it drops off. 20 years, drops off. And then in 2020, at the earliest, we would be bidding and commencing construction. New construction is usually 8 months. Renovations are usually 2 years. So we're looking at the earliest of fall 2022 to transition into a building. And everything would be worked out about where the students would be while another building is built or a renovation or an ad is built. So that would all be worked out with the designer and the project manager. So that gives you an overview. Just as a note, I did look on ClearGov site, which is available through our website on transparency of financials. And in 2016, the town was spending $82 per student for school construction debt service, which was 64% below area towns, and I've listed all the area towns. This will also be on our webpage for future edification, but you can see the different towns. It's hard to read, but there's Natick and Dedham, Norwood, Sharon, Needham, Canton. So there's a lot of towns, and you can see Walpole is third from the bottom on school construction debt. Do you want to get into the... So that concludes the formal presentation. I know we have received 31 questions Some are redundant, others are not. Some we'll have answers for, others we won't. Like, for example, cost estimates, too soon in the process. That's what the feasibilities process is for. You hire a designer, you hire a project manager, and you work with MSBA, and they approve how many square feet you have in a building. They also approve your enrollments. We have an enrollment projection, but that enrollment projection is scrutinized by the MSBA, and they have the final say of how many students they will build a high school for. So you can see it's very prescriptive.
Okay.
Excellent, thank you for the presentation and all of that detailed information. We'll move into the pre-submitted questions, but I think Vice Chairman Stas had a point or a question before we do that. And obviously, yep, some of these have already been answered, so we'll quickly check them off. Others you're unable to answer, but we'll spend time on those, and then we'll have more of a open, freewheeling questions for any other additional feedback or questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr.
Stas.
Chairman. I can't turn my head to the right, so that means I can't look at him. So if I look a little robotic, sorry. But on your color thing there, the slide 11, just question about that, and then slide 15 there. But thanks, Link. So the green is what they do, and blue is us, and then no, I love the visuals. But like where it says detailed design, are they doing the design?
So the design is done by, you work with MSBA.
Right.
And a designer, you go through the designer selection process, and they actually open the bids in Boston at the treasurer's office.
Okay.
And there's a committee that's on the website. I might be able to show you what the website looks like. So the website looks like this.
Oh, you're good.
And you can go through and it'll talk about who's on the designer selection committee. So they actually select the designer for us with input from us.
Okay.
And then they select a project manager, a project management company. Like Compass does a lot of schools. Like Compass is doing the Middleborough School, and they're also doing the fire and the police station, I believe, in town here. DRA is doing Middleborough High School, and they did one of our studies. So they're people we're familiar with usually.
Okay.
But MSBA has the final say because they are spending so much money. So even though it's less than 50% of the project, they have more than 50% of the say.
Great segue. So on 15,
15.
which I can't read, but like, no, I got it here. So cruise over to 15. So like, take Braintree, okay?
Yep.
So total cost 83 million. Now you put MSBA cost is 40 million. Is that their grant or is that an
Yeah.
additional? Okay.
That's their
So it's
grant.
not a cost because then that'd be like 120 million.
Right, that's
Okay.
the grant.
So that's their grant, so that's their contribution.
Right.
If you get the grant based on the parameters that they suggest.
Yes.
With the people that they
Yeah.
want you to use. And they'll
Yes.
say, hey, we'll pay for half of it.
That's right.
Cool.
Right, and they, one thing I failed to mention about, each town has different socioeconomic status that affects your percentage reimbursement. So your per capita income, your property valuation, and also the amount of students you have in your district at the poverty level. And we're about 16% right now. So for example, a town like Taunton, who may be at 80% at the poverty level, will have a higher percentage. They may be up around 80% reimbursement, where we start at 48%. Similar to Chapter 70, the Aid for Education, where they believe it equitably distributes money across the state. Doesn't mean it's adequate. It means they try to be equitable, that everyone contributes money to the state coffers, and then they distribute it through a formula to those communities that are most needy.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get into the questions. I'll run through them unless you want to lead. I think I can make a determination whether or not there may be an answer or not, but I think the first one, with respect to the MSBA General, there's a question here. Can the grant funds only be used toward the building option study? I don't think that's the case. Walpole would have to fund the building option study, or?
There's a
help us out with
caveat to that. I actually asked that to MSBA today, and I got a response that we would have to fund the project in advance. And when a building project is approved, we would then be reimbursed at our percentage reimbursement rate, and it is fully reimbursable.
Okay. So for instance, the $1 million that we're talking about, if the total cost was 100 million, we'd add the 1 million
Yes.
to the 101 million, and then the percentage would apply.
Right, if that were the, if
Okay.
that were the cost, sure.
Okay, excellent. I guess, is the town required to put up money if awarded a grant?
Well, they would have to pay in advance for the feasibility study. And then they would be reimbursed on that at the percentage, as I said before.
Okay.
So that would be the money they would have to put up front. So we're not asking for a vote tonight. We're not asking for money tonight. We're just saying that in next May, if we're accepted in the next 3 weeks, we will be going through the stages, like through school committee vote, board of selectmen vote, finance committee recommendation, and town meeting vote to get feasibility money. And that would have to be upfront money by the town, most likely free cash. That's what town administrator mentioned.
Okay. All right, number 2, we're looking for more information on each of the 3 SOIs submitted.
Okay.
Now, I know that you've told us they're all available online.
Yes.
So is that adequate for the committee, or does anyone desire a further description of those SOIs at this point?
I have a question. The SOIs, is that the exact same that you gave us a year ago?
Yes, they are. No, I think we updated for digital learning. We're trying to stay ahead of technology. So there may have been modifications to technology. Bridget actually wrote those up, so.
Right, and if anything was like rectified, for example, like I didn't have heat in the gym for a year, but then we were able to get the heat. So that might, but now the heat went off again. So you have to change it as it goes along. So if something were to, like if I could find a space, if there was a space to hold my chorus in a different, then I wouldn't put that in the SOI. So we look at it every year to see if we need to make adjustments based upon the needs and the availability.
And with this application factor that you're going through, hypothetically, whatever December brings, one way or the other, if you do not get in this round, are these the exact same papers that are resubmitted, or do you have to go through this process all over again with the paperwork and everything, which is very involved?
We would have to modify that based on most likely the circumstances of why other districts were selected before us. So for example, if they felt the high school shouldn't be number 1 and they should look at Bird first, because we are concerned that they haven't been out to look at the 2 middle schools, when that's our major problem.
High school, yeah.
And they did come out on September 28th, 2016 to look at the high school. So it may be, you have the ability to shift priorities.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
And just on that same question, so do you receive feedback and comment from the MSBA when you resubmit the SOIs, or is that?
Not really, John. What we have to do is look at the list of who was accepted, and we can usually call different school systems. I can call the director, but they're under the hot seat a lot, and a lot of it's very political in the treasurer's office. So it's rare you'll get. It's like not getting a job, and they rarely will tell you why you weren't selected. They'll tell you why other candidates were. So you kind of look at who was selected and why.
Interesting. Okay, good. So the next one, question 3, I think you've already addressed that with your clarified timeline in the presentation, so.
And John, here's a list
Sure.
of everything that's up on, here's the website, our school system, Walpole Public Schools. And you just scroll down, there's a transparency center where I gave you the debt information. It also gives you all our per pupil costs and where we spend money and what our enrollment trends are. You get everything there. And then if you continue to scroll down, you'll see a section called Secondary School Building Study Information. And the PowerPoint from the other night is up there. You have school committee and town boards regarding secondary school building, those are the notes. We have space options study, the master plan from McGuire from 2013, the enrollment study we did last year, and here are the SOIs, Josette, in response to your question. All three of them are right there for your review.
Because I know we've got a stack per school like this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Very
That's-
involved.
That's comprehensive. So a lot of self-service information is right there available for us. That's excellent. Okay. So that takes care of question number 4. Yes, sir,
Oh,
John.
I'm sorry, just
Mr.
the
Lee.
slide
Yes.
made me think of a question, so do I go through you to these guys?
Well, do you want to get through these first?
Well, it's related to
Sure.
that, at least somewhat.
Good.
It-
Yep,
I guess it
yep,
ju-
you always
just
go through the chairman.
dawned on me that this is 3 separate SOIs, and it begs the question of what happens if the state accepts one of those?
Well, if they accept one, then they would address that one building, and then we would have to go back for the other 2. So they could choose to handle one building at a time.
What would that do to you or to us as a town?
It would most likely extend our schedule out 10 or 15 years.
So again, through you, so the town would then make a decision. For example, if the state felt that one of the middle schools was more important than the others. So then we as a committee and the selectmen and you guys would address that and
Yeah.
possibly be put into a position of not looking at all these options, but addressing that school. I guess that's what I'm trying to do.
That's a potential, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I think we saw an example of that with Natick. Three different schools over an 8-year period, or
I'm not sure if
Longer
they
period of time.
applied for all 3 at once, John.
Right.
Or like one, I think was 2012.
right.
One, the high school was, I think, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I don't have that list. See if I can get that list up.
They were all done separately.
Yeah.
They didn't try to do a comprehensive.
I mean, is there history? So 3 SOIs from Walpole. Is that customary that they would all be reviewed and opined on simultaneously, or is it one at a
Well,
time by most communities?
Yeah, I think that we tried to address all the secondary school students with one building, and they appreciated that.
Yeah.
They also appreciate consolidation. They are very aggressive with regionalization. For example, Somerset, Berkeley. Somerset wanted to build a high school, Berkeley wanted to build a high school, and MSBA said, no, we're not building 2 high schools. We'll build 1 high school, and you need to stay regionalized. So they may look at this with favor, or they may not. It just depends on where the designer costs come in, where the project management cost estimates come in, with respect to new versus renovation versus bringing it up to code, land. There's a lot of factors that go into these decisions. And as I said, it's going to take about a year once we get the feasibility study approved to look at everything and be all vetted. I mean, I always expect at least 6 public hearings. I would expect.
Mark, you, Mr. Chairman, if they decided that, if they're looking at the Bird Middle School proposal saying this building really needs to be done, and they say we should do this now, but they don't think the other ones are worthy, could the feasibility study say the most economic thing would be to build a new middle school, but you've got this other one that's going to be in need at some
Right.
point, could you combine the 2?
Right.
Would they go back and revisit that as part of the
sure.
process?
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah. They'll study any option we ask them to.
okay,
Now, they may vet them quickly. They may say, we're not going to look at that
okay.
because of A, B, and C. But as Jen said, what they do is they narrow down options with boards like this.
Okay.
I mean, they may want to come in and meet with the Finance Committee, Board of Selectmen, and School Committee all together and say, listen, folks, these are the 5 options you want to look at. One has no choice. Why spend money? But they may look at all 5. That's why it's such an open-ended process.
Okay, very good. Question 5 is, deals with spaces that are more flexible and able to accommodate more varied instruction. We're asking for some examples or a better illustration of what that looks like, if you would.
I mentioned a few of them in the PowerPoint, but, you know, some other ones, for example, if you want to specifically, like for a high school, you know, or in the middle school, you might have a business class that goes beyond like your textbook definition of marketing and to build an actual product. So you need the space for that. I mean, it's not just a stand and deliver type classroom. Looking at facilities that, for example, would have STEM labs, your science, technology, engineering, or STEAM. You know, you add the arts in there. Labs and maker spaces. We don't have them. I mean, my maker space is a reconstructed closet room. In order for students to be able to do the project-based learning that they need to do, that they can't do right now. It's really, you know, the time has come that, you know, we could be doing better than what we're doing, but we don't have the facilities to do them. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you. Number 6, I think we've already answered number 6 with the information available on the website. I'm sorry?
Do we have enrollment projections?
There, well, in the enrollment studies available on the website, are there projections? I guess I'm making an assumption there.
The projections are on the website, yes.
Okay.
There's a study, and I would like to caution you that, here it is right here. The state may choose to reject any or all of that study. So this is what it looks like, Walpole Public Schools enrollment study. Could serve as a useful guide. You can read that. So what they're saying is the least reliable part of any study is the live births versus the actual children we receive in the schools. And generally we float above live births by 5 to 8%. So there are more children moving into town as infants or toddlers, and then we receive them in our schools. So this is up there for consumption. Additional housing stock. So even though our enrollment declined slightly this year, we're looking at additional housing stock, 260 units in 2018, 17 more in 2019. We're also seeing an in-migration of students. We're seeing about 250 new students every year. We're seeing an out-migration of about 200. So there's about a net 50 increase from in and out migration up until this past year. So that's all there, and we welcome any suggestions. If you think our numbers are high or low, we'd like to hear about that. If you know of more than 276 apartments coming online, let us know. It may be able to be adjusted because of the new zoning with Walpole Woodworkers site, because that's over 55 housing.
Excuse me, that's going to be age qualified.
Age qualified, right.
But you have 346 going in a central downtown district.
346?
346 between Liberty and West Street.
Right, so that's a point of distinction. Does this figure include that new
Yeah.
construction?
There's a lot of construction going on. You should check probably
I
with the
have to
planning
double check
board.
these numbers to
Yeah.
make sure. I think
To
it may have
bring
been a
'em up to
lower
date.
estimate than this.
Yeah.
Right,
I do believe we have that.
right.
I wonder if I have a list of what we looked at.
And is this the same report that was presented last October?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Gives you the historical information you asked for too.
So it probably doesn't include the central business district, which would hadn't. hadn't
That's
been
under
approved.
construction
permits
now.
we
You
had-
Yeah,
weren't
Yeah,
on
we
the agenda yet.
definitely have to follow up on
better,
that.
yeah, there's a
Big
lot of
jump.
construction. Yeah, a big jump.
Yeah, we've been working with the
Two.
town planner,
Yes.
so I'll have to get an updated report from her.
Before she leaves.
She's leaving?
Yes.
Okay, good. The next question, number 7, is somewhat subjective. I think what it's trying to get to here is if we want to kind of characterize, I guess, how we got to this point. And certainly we're still paying on the last renovation on the high school. So if anyone wants to provide some color on
Sure.
why we're at this point.
So a shift in the way we educate children and time is what currently brought us here. I think we already explained what 21st century learning is all about. Obviously, the middle schools, it's a factor of age. They were built so many years ago. Even though you maintain the buildings, over time, certain things just become obsolete. They're not up to current construction codes, so they're going to be very difficult to renovate. The high school, which we expanded upon, and that's where we put the money, it is in good condition, but it's overcrowded. So that was why one of the possible options we were looking at was to move the middle school students into the high school space, and then you could possibly build a new high school and you'd be meeting the needs of everyone, because you'd be taking a building that's in pretty good shape but overcrowded and moving students into that building. So it was a way to meet the needs of the greatest number of students in a cost-effective manner.
I think to add to that, the genesis was the McGuire report, where they identified obsolete building systems within the middle schools. They did give the high school a clean bill of health, but it started us looking at the middle schools and what could we do as a package that would be most cost-effective.
Stas?
Oh, through you, Johnny. Question I have, not so much about the 21st century, but you'd mentioned, like, I've heard a lot about, like, well, the HVAC system, the heating, electrical, stuff like that. I'm just curious, and I'm not looking for a witch hunt, like, who's responsible for maintaining? I mean, like, Johnson's a bomb shelter. There's only so much you can do with concrete, and to knock that down is not going to happen. It'll cost you $8 million to bulldoze that thing. It was built that way for a reason.
It would have to be repurposed.
Totally get that. Totally get that. But I'm just curious, like, why you've got guys staged out of Bird, like, looking to fix a heater. Like, how did we get to that point? Is it on the town? Is it on the school? I'm just curious. Again, I'm not looking to point blame. I'm like, but how is it that, I mean, Harvard's wicked old. How are they doing it? I mean,
Because they have endowments of billions of dollars, and we get about 20 grand a
I think
year
I wasn't
to
looking
fix
for
our
an
heating
answer.
systems.
I wasn't looking for an answer. I know they got oodles of cash, but I'm just like,
The DPW is in charge of the buildings.
and I'm not
Yeah, no, and I'm not casting
making fun of them.
aspersions,
Yeah,
But, they're working with 60-year-old systems, original boilers, and they repair and replace as they can. I don't think anyone could have predicted an overhead air handler, burning from within. So, they do
I get
a
that,
good
but I mean-
job. And the MSB actually gave us credit for the maintenance programs we have, but, after a while, you're just throwing good money at bad.
no, I hear you, but I'm just wondering, like, given the current systems that we have, would it be, do we learn from this and say, hey, you know what, and forget about the schools, I'm just thinking in general, like, do we talk to capital budget and say, hey, you know what, our heating system is,
Yeah, well.
60 years
yeah.
old, maybe we should kind of get that in the queue as
Yeah.
opposed to keep throwing thousands of dollars at it every year when ultimately it's going to fail.
So the schools are in the queues. For example, we did the boilers a couple of years ago at Fisher. We did the windows, and we're finishing the roof. OPR, we're asking for boilers, windows, and roofs this spring. Jim Johnson is through the DPW. I have to qualify that. Bird, we had to do certain sections of the roof, but the roof is just incredible. We did a $400,000 roof job like 8 years ago, but other sections are leaking now, and the cellar was flooded over the last storm. So the town has done what they can, but there are a lot of competing demands for money in this town. And, we have to get in line. And another thing that's affected our timeline is the McGuire report said the police, the fire, and the senior citizens and DPW garage should be in line before us. So we've been waiting. And those buildings are in queue now. And we've been talking about this since the McGuire report, but now it's starting to come down to when the day may come where people in this town will have to make a decision of what they want to do with the buildings.
Fair enough.
Yes.
Hi, Mark Green, School Committee. Just
Mark.
a thought. I teach at King Philip. It's an 11-year-old building. And I think we were the last school that went in under the old school funding program. The new one's been in place for 11 years. One of the criticisms in the old program was that communities was feeling they were letting schools go into decline and intentionally not maintaining them to build up support for new ones. You can't, my understanding is you can't do that now. You have to have something of a maintenance schedule.
We do. Right.
Thank you for that update. Okay. Okay, excellent. Number 8 is just goes to the source and the date and then the source for the $1 to $1.5 million building option study cost estimate. You provide some.
I think we've been down that road, haven't we? Or do you want me to repeat that?
Well, if I missed it, if
Oh,
you
oh,
just briefly
the source of the.
recap. Yeah, the source.
Yeah.
Where's
The source was area towns as well as DRA architects that did the study through the state grant a year and a half ago on the secondary schools.
okay?
And they looked at all the jobs that they have done. They looked at similar sized jobs, and that's the estimate. It could be 1 to 1.5 million, depends on how many options. Reimbursement rate will vary, but we'll start at 48.68%. And then we'll work with MSBA to negotiate what they're willing to reimburse on. If we say we want a $1.5 million study, they say we'll only pay on 1.2 million. They'll pay a percentage of the 1.2, and then we have to negotiate. And as I said, other towns have been able to knock that number down. Some architects look at it as like a lead loss, lead loser, where they'll come in and they'll do the study for less money, hoping they'll get the project. So we're hoping we get a hungry architect who has skill.
Okay, good. Number 8 is just a question regarding the contribution. I think you've clarified and given us the most recent,
Yep.
48% on Fisher, and it's dependent upon the town's socioeconomic status.
Right.
How long ago was Fisher?
Fisher, Mike, 2 years? 2 years ago.
2 years, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead,
I
Dick.
have a question for Dr. Lynch. I got onto your MSBA site.
Great.
Kind of interesting, but I was trying to determine the code and how the heck you get into this. And how you get into the dates for these things. There's 2 projects, one for Bird, one for Fisher. And I thought they were historical. Are they still open?
No, Bird was 200,000
Yeah, that,
and,
190.
yeah, right. What are you trying to find out, Dick?
I was just curious, it was listed and I wasn't aware of the price. I saw them do the building on at Fisher, but I wasn't sure what I'm looking at
Do you know
for
how to help
data
them?
that they throw
So they
out
keep
there.
the historical data of projects that have been done already,
So
and that's
these
what
are
you're
all
seeing there.
completed.
That's all historical complete. Then there's the copy of the SOIs in a related area. I don't know if you can view what I see when I go in, but I see it all together, and you see it categorized by each school building. So you're seeing 2 of the projects that were completed. You were not seeing the SOIs that are in there as well.
Yeah, I was just curious because I didn't know about these. I didn't know anything about SOIs
Uh,
and the school budget process, but it looked to me like almost $700,000 had come to the town through the program.
I think there was,
a reimbursement on
yeah, we'll have to look at that, Dick, and,
Just curious because
we can email you and CC everyone if we have if there's a code or something.
unfortunately, you give somebody information and they don't understand it
Yeah.
and they start looking
So there's.
like me.
Yeah. Now, you know that there's 2 sections of MSBA. One are the accelerated repair program, which that falls under building, boilers, roofs, and windows. And then the other program is called the Core Facilities Program, and that's what we're talking about tonight.
I thought it was actually pretty good that we get reimbursed for something.
Yeah,
to
we
that
tried.
level. So
John
you've
Rogers,
done that, Mike?
Representative Rogers was very helpful.
That was another question I was gonna ask later. How do our legislators figure into this?
Well, MSBA has tried to eliminate the politics involved, and they say they have. You can be a cynical New Englander and question that, or you can believe that. I'll leave that up to you.
In your previous comments a little earlier, you said it's political.
Well,
So I believe it is. I think it's gonna be
I think
like,
anything on the state level becomes a little political when
I
you
think
have
it
everyone
does.
vying for money, and you had a lot of different representatives, and I think our legislators are very aggressive when it comes to advocating for Walpole, so I think we'll be right in the arena.
Thank you, Dick. Next question, there's similar questions further on in the handout, but this goes to how combining the middle schools, why isn't that detrimental to the kids? There are other comments about surveying the parents and really getting the community's feedback around, taking their children in a smaller middle school environment and combining them into this larger building. So is there data? What can you tell us about that? There's a lot of concern and other questions about that impact on the kids.
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that. I personally went through this when my school in New Jersey did the same thing. We had 2 middle schools combined, and kids don't really know any different. They adapt, and it was a wonderful experience. I got to meet students sooner that I would have met in high school at an earlier time, and similar to what Walpole's planning on doing, there's a way to make it so it's not that you're taking kids from a small school and throwing them into this big school, because we had what was called houses, and we're planning on doing something similar, and different wings of the building. So by breaking, I'm going to use the high school, for instance, if we ended up going with that. By taking the high school and moving the 6th graders into a certain wing where they'd be with the 6th graders, and then further taking that and breaking it into 3 teams, you still have that small environment. So I found from my own experience, it was a great way to meet other people sooner. And, like I said, kids know, they don't know differently, and they'll adapt, and you would deal with it by having a certain subsection and then breaking it down into teams. So it would still seem like a small environment in a way.
Also, sometimes with combined middle schools, that you can offer more diverse programming, because there might be a greater number of students to support the enrollment in those courses or extracurricular activities that we wouldn't be able to do with 2 smaller middle schools. You also have staff collaboration of resources, and then also with 1 middle school, students in our elementary school programs will be able to stay with their peers from 6th grade through high school. Now, for example, I house some special education programs that students across town, because it's housed at Byrd, they might not be going with their home neighborhood peers, so they come here. And the same thing for Johnson, the program. So this one, it would be everybody's home school. I think the transition that Jim mentions is really important. It's something that you need to discuss and vet and work through, and have a really solid transition plan when you're taking students from elementary to middle, much like we do now, but obviously it would be in a greater capacity. There are schools out there that do it. There are large middle schools. I think Wellesley has a large middle school of over 1,100 students, and they're able to do it, and that's something that we would need to do. If it comes to that the community has an appetite for that, or we're looking through the MSBA that 1 middle school may be the way to go, we need to make sure that we go out and talk to those school systems that are successful, that have that 1 middle school, and find out what they do in terms of transition and how they run their buildings. Some schools might have 1 assistant principal for every grade level, and they loop through. You have advisor-advisee programs, so the teachers get to know their students. So there's multiple ways that we can take a look at this.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, through you, last year at the presentation, you were talking about class sizes and balance, where at 1 school you have 3 sections of 19 students. At the other school, because of the desired enrollment, you've got 24 in 1 class. If you start sharing the faculty, you can balance out your class sizes. You don't have to worry about, I have to cut a teacher here so I can add a teacher there, and do I even offer this program because only 6 kids want it? And they miss out, but yet there's plenty of room over here to add those 6 kids into existing framework. And that still exists in several programs,
And
right?
that particularly happens when you get to foreign language.
Okay.
Paul? Thanks, John. Just a quick question about logistics. The fields. What do you do with all the athletic fields? I mean, you can't pick them up and shoot them over there. I mean, so busing, parking, I mean,
It depends on what option people go with. I mean, could have to deal with the fields, but right now we have high school kids at Byrd for soccer, softball, baseball. We have volleyball at volleyball at Elm Street School. So it would be a flip. We'd have to look at the start and stop times of the schools, transportation. But, I mean, ideally, if we could find additional land, I mean, that would be ideal to have all the fields at one school. No question about that. You'd have to look at synthetic turf options at certain areas to advance the number of kids you can accommodate with that one field. So there'd have to be a lot of vetting and a lot of conversation about that. And would have to be prepared to make everything as transparent as possible and let people decide.
Okay, thank you. 11 has to do with costs, so we're not ready to address that. 12 is the consolidation of the middle school. I think we addressed that. Well, part of it we have, and part of it we haven't. Creates a better learning environment, better academic and social outcomes than separate smaller middle schools. So we did talk about the 21st century facilities and how that facilitates it, but maybe is there more to it that you want to expand upon with respect to the academic, or have we covered that?
I would say that I don't think it's that a combined middle school is necessarily going to provide a better learning environment. You could probably do the same in two different buildings. You do have some of what Mr. Trudell was talking about, with economies of scale, you can, there's cost benefits. You could probably have two smaller renovated buildings, but it's going to cost more. So you have to weigh all of this, and when you're doing, looking at different buildings. If we wanted to keep the smaller schools, you probably could do that, but you're talking about two schools and renovating existing structures, which would be very difficult to do with modern building codes.
Tom?
One thing that keeps getting to me is, I actually took the reports and gave it to some of my project managers to take a look at. One thing they said was Walpole was lucky to have buildings that were in structurally that good of a shape. Basically, our buildings suffer from MEP issues, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. Within the world of construction,
Excuse me, could you talk louder, because you can't hear you over this?
see, these are just for YouTube, so you gotta yell, kid.
so basically our buildings suffer from mechanical, electrical, plumbing issues. In fact, when you read the reports, they talk about how structurally good they are. I'll be honest, whatever we build will not be as good as what was built before. And I'll guarantee you the boilers will not last 50 years. That's just the nature of things nowadays. We tend to build more obsolescence into everything. People built well generations ago. So I'm a little concerned when you look at this. We could redo boilers, we could redo roofs, redo windows. Electrical, mechanicals, they're not that exciting. So I think we really need to look at that when we're looking at these, because like I said, we will not build anything as good as what we would be knocking down. It's just not the nature of what construction is in this day and age. So fixing these buildings, not that hard. Operationally, there may be other issues, but I can bring a team in there and redo electrical and mechanical without that much effort. The size of the rooms and other issues may be it, but physically, these buildings are great, like structure, so I think we really need to look at that in terms of costs going forward.
We'll be required to the least expensive option that's educationally sound.
Yep.
Ellie?
So I'm going to disagree that these buildings are physically acceptable. I am a mother of a child with special needs who is in a wheelchair. If we begin to renovate these buildings and follow the ADA compliances that will be required of us, the cost will be out of control. I was a student at Johnson from 4th grade to 8th grade. Very few classes were, so I spent a nice 5 years in the concrete building. I did a personal tour last week, and looking at the building as when I was a student, yeah, it seemed fine. But as an adult looking at it and having a child with special needs and having so much more knowledge now, this building is not adequate at all. The electrical that has been updated is a tube through the building, which now takes the sound, so you can hear everything in that whole building everywhere. I'm not only talking about children with special needs. The town has done a great job developing program for children with special needs and keeping our special education costs down. But sometimes at the point that children with special needs are not getting adequate buildings. So a child in a wheelchair cannot attend an assembly. They cannot get on stage. Our nursing facilities don't have handicap accessible bathrooms. There are a number of students now in IEPs and 504 combination plans for testing. Our testing that is required of our students is much more rigorous. They go into the office, which is a space that they're supposed to be able to follow these plans, which are legal documents, and it sounds like they're in the middle of a drum class. The only meeting space at Johnson Middle School cannot even have enough teachers, say a teacher team meeting, but more importantly, there's no private space for a child and a family to have an IEP meeting. If you have never attended the meeting, you typically have your principal, you could have your school guidance counselor or school psychologist, 2 parents, a PT, an OT, a speech therapist, their special education teacher, and their homeroom teacher, as well as maybe the parents actually want to bring in an educational advocate. There is no space for that. The special education classrooms are now in the middle of the buildings because of their smallest classrooms available, so most of our special education classrooms do not have windows for outside. There's a number of problems in these 2 buildings that if you got to start renovating it, and I'm saying there's not that many students in wheelchairs in our schools, but if we're going to continue to have our special education through our schools and have our students in our schools, which I am okay with. My daughter did most of her education in her local schools, and we were lucky that we were not, just across town with neighbors she didn't know. But the renovation costs to bring these schools up to date and up to codes are going to be very excessive. Just a different perspective than maybe other people
Accessibility
on the board
will
do
be
not have.
addressed too. Sprinkler systems too.
All right, thank you, Ally. 13, I think we've addressed that. 14, I think we can drill down into that a little bit more. Some good questions here with respect to appropriate instructional and functional spaces. Is there any data from comparable communities and graduating students with respect to their MCAT scores, their college testings, college acceptances, that validate some of these premises with respect to these, 21st century, facilities?
Well, I think when you look at our SAT, our AP, our other standardized test scores, we do very well. We do far above the state average. Our faculty and our administration and our governance, our school committee, we work hard to do well with what we have. We're saying we can do better. We can say we can do better with more modern facilities and more opportunities for our children. I think that when you look at schools around us like Franklin and Stoughton and Natick building new high schools, and we have competed with these school systems, but I think we need to educate our children for their future, not our past. And I think we need to look towards the future when our buildings are over 60 years old, 2 of them, and one is approaching 15. By the time we're done with the study, it'll probably be closer to 25. Not the study, but when we're done construction, that is. So I think that we have an obligation to bring this to the attention of our parents and our community, and I think that we have done well with what we have, but I think that there's room for improvement.
Very good. So 15 is an interesting question based upon the town's history with overrides. there's a suggestion that doing a, lost my place here. Okay, this, yeah, I guess it's a little, it's premature for this particular question. We don't know how this would affect the average tax bill. We don't know
No.
which option would be
No,
selected.
we would
So-
defer to the assessors and the town administrator. Once the feasibility study is done, once a preferred option is selected by the community,
Right.
we would have that. So we are a year and a half away from that.
Okay. And with those options, we were touching on this a little bit a few minutes ago. So there's a core program, but then there's also a repair program.
Yes.
Are those intertwined, or do you have to choose, or does the MSBA, guide you or make suggestions on?
Well, it depends on what your situation is. If you need boilers, roofs, and windows, you can go with a repair program. But they won't do roofs, they won't do handicap accessibility, they won't help you bring you up to code. And it doesn't address educational space.
So are we pursuing any of the repair programs?
We've pursued for Bird, we've pursued it by Fisher, we talked about that earlier. There are times when the town can do the project for less money without MSBA involvement. For example, with Fisher School, we were able to do the roofs with MSBA, but the DPW decided to do the boilers without MSBA. Because once you start engaging MSBA, you have a lot more regulations, you have prescribed contractors, you have verification programs that delay projects. So if you have a boiler or a roof that's leaking, sometimes you can't wait for MSBA to go through their matriculations. The wheels of bureaucracy move very slowly. As you can tell, we've been talking about these projects for a couple of years now.
Okay, thank you. I think I got a little bit ahead of myself. So 16 was the question that I was alluded to. That was, due to the town's history with reluctance to pass overrides, does it make sense to place a non-binding referendum potentially on the ballot to gain an appetite for the citizens in view of the $1 million, $1 to $1.5 million for the option study? Again, is this premature? Have we considered this? I thought it was a pretty good question to throw out there.
I think that's the role of town meeting, since RTMs are elected to represent the community. I think that's who should be making the determination.
So you'd be interested in having the RTMs respond to this suggestion, or have them take it up?
We could, they're going to have to vote on it, right? On whether or not to appropriate the money and fund it. So I think ultimately they're the ones who are going to be making that decision. It gets vetted, other boards vote, but.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you don't think a non-binding resolution
Seems like
makes sense, or is a good idea?
I think it seems like a lot of work when you can accomplish the same thing by having the RTMs vote and do what they've actually been elected to do, which is make determinations for people that they're representing. So I think that's the better way to do it.
Right. Right. So obviously the RTMs, the RTM things have to be approved at town meeting, then ultimately has to go in front of all the voters. So we've seen a divergence between those two groups in the past. The non-binding resolution would allow the voters to have a say, therefore, getting a little insight into the appetite of the town. So, Ally?
I think also right now it's the timeline. It really depends in December when we find out if we were invited or not. Would give the timeline to allow for that. So if in December we are invited to the program, by May town meeting, a vote has to be taken place on the feasibility study. If we're not invited in December, I think that is something that can be re-looked at and addressed, because then you would have the time to allow for it.
For the town election.
Andrew?
I just want to comment on this question. I don't know who wrote it. I didn't. I think it would be short-sighted to do a non-binding advisory referendum, because the whole point of the study is to give the town voters information about what their options are. So it'd be asking them to make an early decision with little information when they could wait, spend $1 million, explore this issue in depth, and then decide. So that's just my comment.
Susan?
I had a similar reaction to that, which is one of the ways this town spins its wheels sometimes is we're chasing our tail. So if you put something out there without specifics, the complaint will be, I can't vote for this, I don't know what the specifics are. The way that you actually get something before a voter so that he or she can make an intelligent, informed decision on how to vote, whether it's an RTM or the people in town, is to tell them precisely what it is that you plan to do or want to do and what it's going to cost and all the rest. And so I think it would be wasteful and probably counterproductive. I had two quick questions through you, Mr. Chairman. What year was Byrd Middle School built?
1961.
61, and Johnson?
I can look it up. I want to say it was.
I think someone told me that Johnson was the
It was 63.
64.
I have it.
So both were built in the early 60s.
In the 60s, I don't know whether it was the early 60s.
Okay, thank you.
Find out.
It's in the SOIs, I believe.
We got that Google stuff. Okay, good. Moving right along. So that was 16, 17. Couple of questions there. I believe we've already addressed those. 19 and 20. I believe we've addressed those with the earlier discussion as well. Thereafter, there's some, observations or comments from discussions with students. I don't, some of these are relevant to talk about a little further. Others just provide some color for things that have already been mentioned. I kind of read through here.
Mr. Chairman, can you give me a little background of these surveys? I mean, was it 3 kids, 6 children? Was it their children? I mean, I don't understand.
Yeah, sure.
because it's
So,
not
yes, it was,
consistent with what we're hearing from other
yeah, it
students in
was
schools.
family members,
Family
members. Just a handful of students, several, so it wasn't a broad, study. It was some ad hoc conversations with family members, just to gain some firsthand data.
Mr. Chairman, for you? This is one of the reasons why I objected to this format, because this was supposed to be a meeting where school committee presented to finance committee and finance committee interacted. And so I just don't understand how surveys are done and people who are not on finance committee are having input. I think it's inappropriate. There will be, from what I understand, ample opportunity for students, parents, townspeople to ask any kind of questions they want, but.
Yeah, so if I can just respond to that. So no one other than finance committee members participated in this exercise. And as I provided information at the beginning of the meeting, distributing agendas, reports, documents, other questions that will then be discussed and deliberated is acceptable under the open meeting law. Some of these comments perhaps could have been eliminated. So with that being said, we don't need to talk about some of the subjective comments any further. I thought it would be helpful to get some feedback. Again,
It might be helpful if we do a broader survey so we can make
Yes.
sure that some of the themes identified are truly themes that represent the, you
yeah,
know,
I agree
do some
with
better,
that.
maybe
Absolutely.
statistical sampling so we can.
Absolutely. Okay. So I think, okay, let's go, again, these are a lot of comments, so again, we'll skip those. So let's now, so I think we've made it through most of these questions, comments, and we'll now open it up to any new comments or questions that have surfaced through our discussions tonight. Andrew?
I didn't write question number 30, but I thought it was a good question. It's about what happens like in the transition period. So I'm just going to read it. Johnson is
thank
bomb
you.
shelter. Byrd has the best field. So if we were to replace, where do we put the kids while something is being built? Just, I know
Okay.
that's kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but.
All right, so I can't answer you directly because we don't have a preferred option yet
Yeah.
that feasibility study has recognized. But let's say, for example, you take the option that was recommended by DRA. So what would happen would be you would build a building on, you would segregate Bird property, build a building. You would, then, when the building is complete, move the high school students into the new building and move Bird students and Johnson students into the existing high school. And then you would demolition Bird, but you would repurpose JMS. And then you would build fields where Bird is. That's what was presented a year ago at this meeting. You weren't here, Andrew, I'm sorry. So that's one option. Now, if you wanted to, say, renovate and add to Bird and combine the schools that way, you would build an addition to Bird. You would move Bird students into the addition. You would renovate the existing Bird. When that is done, you would move Johnson students into the renovated addition. So I think it's important when you look at all these options to answer those questions. What will happen to the students? What options require students be displaced? For example, there may be an option if you renovate both middle schools. You would probably have to stagger those. But what do you do with the Bird Middle School students? Do you employ a pod of temporary classrooms out on one of the fields? Do you rent space in another school somewhere? I mean, that's what have been done. Just there's all kinds of different options to look at, and that's what the feasibility study would look at. What would happen to the students? How would you phase the projects to displace the fewest amount of students? And that's why the last architect we talked to chose what we submitted to as SOIs to MSBA, as no students would be displaced. Other than, obviously, you're going to lose a couple of fields, or you're going to lose access to certain parts of the property. Right? So if you're building a high school on Bird's fields, you're going to lose those fields for a certain amount of time. Unless you build on the upper end of the property. But then you lose parking, and what do you do with parking? So it's really too premature to have answers to that, but those are the type of things that architects will look at and provide the community with options. Mark?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. The other possibility would be to split the grades, and I don't think there's capacity either property-wise or facility-wise to move sixth grade back to elementary.
No, there is not capacity in those buildings.
And neither
to do
with
that.
neither with enough field ground space to add trailers for their curriculum, right?
That has to be investigated.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer to that, but most likely.
Okay. Susan?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. What year was the McGuire study done?
2013.
And is that study available
It is online on our website
on the school website?
and the town website.
Okay,
So on the school website, it's right under school building study information.
okay.
It's hard to see. McGuire report
There
right
it is,
there.
okay, good. I just want to say to the Finance Committee, I think it's important, I'm going to reread it, I read it back then, but I think it's important to read that so that you can know what that group said about the schools and the needs, number one. And number two,
Yep.
there was a tour of the schools recently, the high school and Bird Middle, and I think there were only a handful of us, 4 people? And it was designed for this committee to get firsthand knowledge. One of the things we used to do in Finance Committee is tour not only the schools but other facilities to see how monies were being spent and what the needs were, and particularly in terms of the facilities. And I think it's very hard to do that, to understand the needs through conversation or even photographs. I think you really have to get out and look and see. So I would urge every single person on this committee to do those tours, because you'll be able to ask questions and see the physical plant and what the issues are. And I think all the conversation in the world is just not going to make you understand the needs in the way that actually walking around and talking to the staff, teachers, and so forth. So I don't know, find a way to get there for the next tour, or if you can't, probably you could even get your own customized tour if you
I would be more
asked.
than happy.
Okay, but I think that's critically important.
The other thing to keep in mind is, we're doing these tours on the weekend. You're not going to fully appreciate the overcrowding issue
Right.
like you did on the tour when we were standing there and I was up against the locker
Right.
because there was no room in the hallway because so many students were rushing by. So, it's hard to bring people into the building during school time for, safety reasons. But that being said, some of that overcrowding you're not going to be able to see on a
We'll
weekend.
be happy to schedule a tour for the balance of the finance committee. It's just difficult to synchronize schedules.
Dick, why don't you take a turn?
Yeah. Dr. Lynch and Jen. The information's there if you want to go get it. And I tell you, I found the school department to be very transparent, letting me in there to see what goes on. The thing that troubles me with these kinds of projects in this town is everybody lines up and asks logistics questions when we don't even know where we're headed. And I think we need to embrace the project with a very open-minded approach from the FinCom and from the other aspects of the departments in the town that are going to be making judgment. Dr. Lynch mentioned the fact that a lot of bright people, I think Jen said that, and there really are a lot of good people. We have a lot of architects, we have a lot of building people, we have, Tom does it for his business in multi-million-dollar projects. I think we have to kind of trust a little the process. And I've been listening a lot to a guy that went through the process who's a town member here, a town meeting member, Ed Forsberg, who's chairman of the Capital Budget Committee. He's also the plumbing inspector in Norwood, and he raves about the great school they built in place of the old school, and it sits practically in the same spot. I mean, that could be a laboratory, I think, for us to look at what they did. Did they get half that, more than half was paid by that authority we're now working with?
That's right.
And
It's
I
a
think
model school, too.
what I'd like to see is a little better effort for different members of different boards to work together, not to be obstacles, but to look at it. If the numbers don't work, that's a problem. But if you vet the thing properly, it's gonna come out, I think, for the better of the town. And that's, I don't wanna see my neighbor or someone else saying, what the hell did you vote for the school for? Because of our taxes. It all is interrelated, but let's start this process fresh. And that's how I would like to approach it.
Andrew, Gisette?
I agree with Dick. We have been, and thanks to Nancy, we've come a long way, because originally in this town, you were either for the school, you were against the school. The town was divided. And through a lot of hard work, through Nancy Gallivan specifically, and high praise, that you have pulled the town together a lot under your leadership over the years. And everybody that's been working with Nancy over the years, including you, Link. There's a whole different environment here now than there was 15 or 20 years ago. It was nasty. And we don't want to return to there. We want to go forward with an open mind.
Andrew? Quick technical question. You mentioned in the presentation an eligibility period. So my question is about timing. So assuming the SOIs are accepted and we're admitted into the program, what if there's a moment where the town kind of drops the ball, where say at the Springtown meeting we don't allocate funds to do a study, or in the future the Board of Selectmen don't put something before the voters? Are we still in the program, or if the town, how much patience is there for the town's politics to work this out, is my question.
You have 270 days to take the vote for the feasibility study. If it fails, they give you another try. If that fails, you go back into the pool, and your everything is It begins again. It's like Groundhog Day.
So you get one mulligan vote.
You get a mulligan and then
270 days. Got it.
yeah, and you can work with MSBA.
There you go, listen to Sonny and Cher.
Yep.
And that was one of the things MSBA really looked at when they visited. They wanted to know, do your boards work together? Is the town supportive of education? And that's what MSBA looks at too, when they make their decisions. They don't want to put all this time and effort in if it's a losing cause.
Something else I suggest we do, Nancy had been suggesting this for some time, is there are model buildings that we can tour, and we should learn from the experience of other towns that have gone through this. I mean, that Link spoke with someone from Middleborough, and we can find out what worked in their towns, what didn't work, and how the process works. So more than just, the people in our town who have experience, by looking at some of these other buildings, we'll learn a lot too.
We did that with the senior center.
And I've worked with architects before, and they'll bring a bus in, and they'll take as many people as you want. And we'll go look at Natick High School, we'll look at Franklin, new high school in Franklin, we'll look at a new middle school, high school in West Bridgewater. So there's a lot of places and what you can do really is tangibly compare, a current 20th century building with a 21st century building, and you can see it in action. And you can talk to the educators and say, what can you do now that you couldn't do with a 60-year-old building?
Any further questions? Bess?
Answer your question, March of '67, that's Johnson's birthday.
March of '67. I just had one more comment. I'm just smiling thinking of a tour I took one time at the high school when Senor Watson was still here.
Yeah.
And we had recommended in town meeting approved funding for the language lab. But when we actually went to see it, he was laughing about the fact that they had, prior to this renovation, cassettes. And there were kids who would come into the language lab and say, what is this? Like they had never seen one. And it was funny, but it was not funny because things are moving so rapidly, it kind of leaves you breathless. And we don't want to let our kids fall behind. So.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming and presenting to us and spending the time answering the questions. We really appreciate you taking this night away from your families to come educate us. That's exactly what we were looking for. It's helpful. This committee is very appreciative. So we'll go forward from here and stay tuned for December 12th, right? The big day.
Mr. Chairman, motion to adjourn?
Second.
Minutes, right?
2 minutes.
All those in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So adjourned.